Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss and internet shitlords, and well, this pretty much had to happen, didn't it? All right, so I've got here 3 of my products. Oh, and a meatball. Hello, meatball. How's it going? I know it's early for me to do a video, but, well, this is top news. Yeah, you go ahead and drink your water there. So I've got 3 of my products here, Sword and Caravan, Dark Albion, and the Old School Companion 2. The top 2 here, Sword and Caravan and Dark Albion, are campaign settings for the Lion and Dragon game, but you can also use them in any OSR RPG. Dark Albion is basically England during the War of the Roses, and Sword and Caravan is a setting for adventures during the Third Crusade in the Holy Land and the Silk Road, just before the Mongolian invasion. So like at the peak period where the Silk Road was at its most majestic. And the Old School Companion is a collection of a large number of, I think there's, 26, 27 medieval authentic adventures that you can run for Lion and Dragon, or you can run for any other OSR game. And, you know, there's a lot of really great stuff there. Now, these 3 products, besides all being mine and besides all being for Lion and Dragon, have something else in common, which is that in a more medieval authentic type of game, you're often going to find yourself facing off against human opponents, perhaps more frequently than you would in like a high fantasy game. And so it's quite common in all of my campaigns that I've run of Lion and Dragon, in Dark Albion or in Sword and Caravan, and they certainly show up in some of the Old School Companion material, that the baseline opponent you're going to be facing isn't going to be, say, like a goblin or a kobold, right? Where, like, you know, in a lot of fantasy worlds, if you're like wandering around and you have a random encounter, there's a good chance that if instead of being humans, it'll be some kind of low-level humanoid. But instead here, you're going to be encountering, most likely, bandits, right? Which are typically gangs of peasants, sometimes disgruntled mercenaries, occasionally some kind of defamed knight who are setting themselves up in the dangerous areas between centers of civilization, between the manors and the cities. Outside of those places in the roadways, there was terrible danger. And that's one of the important aspects of kind of the medieval authentic world, that civilization is really is the points of light that hold everything together. And humans themselves descend into chaos when they're taken away from civilization, or civilization is taken away from them. A lesson that we have all been seeing in real life very, very frequently these last few years. So, you know, imagine my surprise today. And I wasn't sure if I was even going to do a video today. I'm kind of debating also like whether I'm going to do a live stream on Sunday or not, because I often do live streams on those Sundays when I'm free. But I did a live stream this Monday, and it went really well. Check it out if you haven't checked it out yet. And so I'm not sure yet what I'm going to do. Maybe I'll do a live stream, but only if there's like some other news that's like really exciting between now and Sunday. But in any case, I was checking on Twitter, and what do I find is that the latest mandate from on high has come to the woke, and they are now declaring the new thing that's problematic. The new thing that's problematic is bandits. So here we are. So first of all, if you want to piss off the woke, then be sure to buy Sword and Caravan, Dark Albion, Lion and Dragon, Old School Companion, the Wilderlands sourcebook for Sword and Caravan. If you've already got Sword and Caravan, that'll give you some additional material. Check all of that stuff out, right? And also subscribe to my channel. But what these guys are now claiming is basically that if you involve bandits in your game, it is very, very problematic, right? I didn't hear anyone say yet that it makes you a fascist. They still haven't brought the race issue into this. So this is I'm catching this. Usually I don't quite catch something right at the beginning of the trend, right? Like I think that this is going to be like an expanding subject for them, because they've started with something incredibly stupid, but not as stupid as it can potentially get, right? And so they always find a way to get more stupid before the whole thing kind of peters out. So like I haven't heard anyone actually actually make, ironically, okay, this is really weird, right? Because bandits are human, right? So in theory, a bandit could be white, black, yellow, any color of the human spectrum, let's say, right? They could be any kind of person, right? And there have been in every culture, all throughout societies, throughout all the history of the world, there were bandits, right? So it is not unique to any one race of people, race of or cultural group, right? What there's never been in the world are orcs, and yet we still don't have the argument that if you're opposing bandits, that makes you a white supremacist. But if you're opposing orcs, you are. So that tells you what the woke gamer crowd think. When they think bandit, I don't know, they're thinking of like, I guess, drug users in like the San Francisco area there, who are mostly, from what I've seen, they look like a lot of those guys are just, they're white, they're just like the underclass of urban San Francisco, because also San Francisco doesn't have an enormous black population, right? Same thing with Seattle, right? So like, I think they're thinking of the homeless or whatever, and thinking, okay, so the homeless are going to rob you, right? You're supposed to allow them to rob you, and those are because they're disadvantaged because society has failed them. It's your fault that they have to rob you. Actually, if they have to stab you, it's also your fault, right? But they're not necessarily thinking black people. When they think black people, they think of orcs, which is just bad shit, right? But there you go. This is the inherent racism of the American left. So it's the first thing that I saw about this was a guy named, I think it was Dev the Guy or something like that, who said, I'm not saying something like this. He said, I'm not saying you're not allowed to use bandits, but you really have to think about the context of them when you use them, right? Because, like bandits, like the context of bandits is pretty simple, right? They're killing, murdering, sometimes raping, definitely stealing, because they want to make money, right? Now, some of them, yes, there are times when you had like people who were peasants who were starving, right? And who would turn to banditry because they literally didn't have food to eat. And sure, I mean, that's real, right? But the problem is that turning to that still doesn't fix anything. This like conceit that somehow if you're poor, because also, of course, the people that are poor in our society aren't stealing to eat. They're stealing to, loot fancy purses, right? Stuff like that. So this is ridiculous, right? Like the poorest person in America lives in a way that a medieval duke would have envied, right? They just have an astounding level of worldly comforts and protection and support, right? That nobody in the Middle Ages had. But like in actual impoverished nations, right? In actual like pre-industrial nations, right? So like in parts of the third world today, this is still true. And certainly it was true throughout the world before the Industrial Revolution, okay? That there would be people who are literally starving. And so they will go and try to kill other people to take their food, right? That's banditry. And it's a banditry that one can certainly comprehend the motivation for doing it. You can't quite blame them. But like in the context of social cohesion, in that context, in that paradigm, and in that world, it must be severely punished, right? Because there was no alternative, because the alternative otherwise is a collapse to even further barbarism, right? You can say, well, we have to provide for the poor, but also the thing is most of those societies do provide for the poor in certain ways. Now, some of them, they fail to manage to adequately maintain that, and that's where you get anarchy and chaos. But you don't fix that by giving licentiousness to that anarchy and to that chaos, right? As soon as you do that, things fall apart further. Instead, what you have to do is you have to draw back the chaos, push back the chaos, and to renew the power of law, to establish the civilizational order again, and that means the ones who have been wicked must be punished, and the ones that are vulnerable must be protected, and the fact is, and I mean, you see this in every third world country, right? You see this in first world countries, in the democrat impoverished cities of North America, right? That every time you hear some communists say, "Oh well, it's justified for people to steal because they're poor, and that's not their fault. That's the fault of the system, right? The poor can't help but steal, right?" That's always proven to be bullshit, because 90% of the poor do not steal. Okay, it is always 10, 15% depending, but like it's always a very steep minority of the urban poor. I don't even mean the working class. I mean even the ones that don't have work, right? That are engaging in violent crime. Only a tiny percentage of them do. And that's because most people have some kind of minimal level of moral conditioning, right? That is preventing them from doing that, right? So as soon as you say the poor can't help but steal, what you're doing is you're basically damning an entire social class. But this guy thinks, well, like if you're adventurers, what you have to do is you have to have these guys that, they're bandits, but they have like this high social justice training, right? Like they went to Paulo Freire schools, and they know that they're actually revolutionaries. And the PCs have to give them all their stuff and kneel and say they're sorry because this is social justice or something like that. And that's what this guy's asking you to do. But he was actually quoting in his statement, this Dev the guy, who is a he/him, by the way, he states it as much, right, is quoting the actual initiator of this argument, which is I can't read my own writing. Flighty Broad, I think it is, who had the original quote. Now, Flighty Broad it's interesting, right? Because Dev the guy, weak sauce, he's only he/him, right? But Flighty Broad, she is like at the absolute top of the pronoun hierarchy. Flighty Broad is an it/she. I swear to God, right? She is an it/she, or it is an it/she, right? So Flighty Broad said that if in your campaign you're fighting bandits and you're doing it to help a kingdom, then you're not an adventurer. You're a cop. That was the statement. You are a cop, and therefore, you're, I guess, ACAB is what she's saying, right? And deserve some kind of horrible punishment, because they don't believe that one of the fundamental elements of myth and of legend, and therefore of the RPG setting structure, not just any specific setting, but in general, the concept of fantasy, right, as a descendant of legend and myth, and RPG play being mainly fantasy, one of the central elements, one of the central themes of it is the protection of civilization against chaos, right? That's the theme in every great fantasy story, right, is to try to either protect or restore civilization. Right? That's true in King Arthur. It's true in the French saga. It's true in Viking stories, right? Like these Vikings were practically barbarians, and yet even they have this concept, right? They understand this, because every culture that is not ours understood this, right? We are the only culture that has become so technologically advanced, so unbelievably rich, and I don't mean Elon Musk. I mean you, the person listening to this right now. You are 100 times richer than the average human throughout history. Okay, like you are so much richer, and you have such a more comfortable life that you cannot even conceive of what the regular average human life would have been like, and you'd probably have just offed yourself rather than do it, right? Like if you were faced with that as a result, right? And like all of I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought, right? But my point is fundamentally that only our culture can have such a blinded conception that we think that everything that we live in, the things we have, right, to electricity and running water and microwaves and heating, and the fact that we will always be in close proximity to food, and that there is a social network, like a social setup by which we will not starve to death unless we really, really want to or contribute to something to make ourselves starve to death, right? Like nobody dies from starvation in the Western world without there being some very weird mitigating circumstances, right? And that we are protected for the most part from violence, or at least were until very recently, right? Because now what we're seeing is that in cities in the first world, the government itself has decided to make war on its own citizens and is no longer offering that protection. They have given carte blanche to the raiders, to chaos, right? And they know they can steal and they can assault and they can kill with impunity. And so this is one of the biggest marks of civilizational collapse, right? This is not managed decline. This is civilizational collapse. Because once that happens, unless you get someone that comes forward and says, I'm going to set this all right and make the people who did this pay, right? Unless that happens, what you end up with is complete collapse of a society. So, in all of that, we have such privilege that we can't imagine the regular, normal context of most of the world up until the Industrial Revolution. And it's still parts of the world today. Right? It's not much of the world anymore. In the last 50 years, in particular, the rise of capitalism as a tool to overcome poverty, because it was capitalism, right? For 100 years, there were charitable donations being given to the non-Western world. There was all kinds of aid. We Are the World and Live Aid and all that stuff. Millions and millions and millions and billions of dollars being given to third world countries that accomplished nothing, right? That money was just squandered and the exact same conditions continued. And then there was investment. And as soon as people started doing investment, that's when lives turned around in Africa and Asia and Latin America. And now the areas where there is actual, abject poverty, that, less than a $2 a day poverty, is tiny. It's unbelievable what we've accomplished. Will it last? I don't know. I'm very cynical about that because the West is clearly being destroyed from within. And when it goes, it's going to be hard to say whether the rest of it can hold together. So I don't know. You might find out just why in every element of historical myth and fantasy, the concept of punishing the evildoers and preventing anarchy, preventing the chaos, is an essential aspect of that myth, right? Of that story, of the story of civilization, of human civilization, and how this is not, some idiot postmodernist might interpret that as meaning, oh, well, but that's just the power elite holding on to their control. No, everybody understood in the ancient world. People bemoaned the chaos whenever there wasn't this structure, this hierarchy. Because in fact, we want to imagine, because people in our culture are so brainwashed by the creation of this kind of false historicity of this era in the 1960s of these Marxists who had no idea what they were talking about, or who did and were actively lying to you, of suggesting that basically all of human civilization was an act of power of a minority over a majority, and oppression of all kinds of classes, right? And that in most parts of society, people were basically ground into the dirt, and that it was a system that only benefited the most powerful. And there is the lie, because obviously, I would much rather live in our society than in a medieval society, right? But in a medieval society, that was a system that worked for all the classes involved because it allowed stability and protection. It obviously, if you were a noble, you had a more comfortable life than if you were a peasant. But it was a system that everybody understood was much better than the alternative. The alternative was the Dark Ages. It was the collapse of Rome, right? That was the alternative. And there was no better alternative that could be brought up with yet, right? Because there's no such, that you couldn't have just done a revolution there and changed everything. It doesn't work that way, right? That sort of change has to happen through a gradual process. And I mean, so I'm not saying, on the like some people, I'm not saying we have to go back to a medieval feudalist model of government, right? That is a stupid idea. But what I'm saying is that model was an extremely functional model, and that anybody who goes against any of the models of civilization, not just by which I mean not that they're saying, well, there's an alternative, better model that we know works better, but by saying we have to tear down all hierarchies. Right? First of all, when you're talking about tearing down all hierarchies, inevitably what you're actually talking about is creating the most primitive of all hierarchies, which is the hierarchy of a tiny group of people ruling out of sheer might and brutality. That's always what ends up happening. You never end up with the communist utopia, right? So this idea is of well, just let's tear down all the structures. Those structures are not there to oppress you. They're actually there to place limits on the people who would oppress you, to place limits on everybody from the bandits to the guy with the army. Right? It's all of those guys that are being limited by the structures of civilization. They're the ones that would most benefit if civilization collapses, and everybody else would suffer horrendously. Right? And that's what these idiots on Twitter are essentially advocating for. They're talking about because it's one of the fundamental steps, right? So you've got one of them saying, well, you shouldn't be representing the actual force of civilization, that's to say the king, in your game, right? You shouldn't be fighting to protect civilization. You should be fighting to overthrow civilization. And then the other one, he's saying, well, you've got to consider these problematic aspects. No, you don't, right? This is evil. There's evil, not the people, because they're humans, right? So humans commit sin. They're not inherent, the inherent evil of them is not something that can really be measured compared to everybody else's inherent evil. Right, but they are in error, and that error is itself an evil because it destroys civilization. So that is the whole point of fantasy, is actually that the bad guys have to be bad, and that they are representative of things in the real world that are bad and have to be fought. And sometimes it's not as simple as like slaying a dragon. But what the dragon represents is something that must be slain in our real world, in our real society, And if you take the side of the dragon, then you're the monster. You're the monster that wants to destroy the world, right? That wants to devour everything in its path. And you are then part of the evil. So I guess that's everything for today. If you like this video, please press the like button and share it anywhere you think people will find it interesting, or anywhere that people might be pissed off about it. And subscribe to this channel. And if you want to support me, then please check out my products like the ones you see here and all the other ones that are in my description. Got Star Adventurer, if you prefer space opera at a medieval authentic. I've got World of Last Sun if you prefer like Gonzo science fantasy kind of post-apocalypse gaming. Invisible College if you like modern day horror and occultism and spy agencies, and lots of other stuff that is out there right now with the RPG Bandit Present series. I am continuing to work on an upcoming new series of short products, and also very soon, keep your eyes open for Heroes and Villains of the Silk Road, a collection, 125 pages, I think, of historical biographies of the major figures of the Levant and the Silk Road from around 1190 to 1220, along with their stats, and along with some new material for Sword and Caravan, including the Assassin class and some more high-tech items by the Song Empire. So keep your eyes open for that. And meanwhile, check out all my other products. I really appreciate everybody's support. It's a big deal for me in terms of being able to make a living, obviously, but also to keep up the animus for the fight against the kind of nonsense that is always that's always surprising. I should have known that sooner or later we'd get to, bandit lives matter. So that's everything for today. Currently smoking Lorenzetti egg plus what is this? Gowitz Balkan flake.